Hello everyone, and welcome to my Bold and Beautiful Gossips 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. No Bone anticipated the Verity to come out the way it did. Not Eric, not Ridge, and clearly not Taylor. For weeks there had been a strange turnabout running through the Forrester family, a pressure that no one could relatively put their cutlet on, but everyone could feel. It wasn't the usual business pressure, or the moping emotional scars from Ridge's endless reverse and forth between Brooke and Taylor. This was commodity darker, heavier, commodity embedded in secrets that had been precisely buried and defended, until they were ent. It all began with Eric noticing the change in Taylor. She wasn't the same woman who had returned to Los Angeles with quiet stopgap and familiar warmth. There was a heedfulness in her eyes now, a vacillation when certain names were mentioned, a subtle pullout whenever Ridge entered the room. Eric, who had erected an conglomerate by trusting his instincts, couldn't ignore it. He saw the way Taylor's phone no way left her side, the way her smile faded when Ridge talked about their future, the way she squinched when the history was brought up. Commodity was passing behind the scenes, and Eric knew it was only a matter of time before it exploded. Ridge, meanwhile, was blissfully ignorant or maybe consciously eyeless. He believed he was eventually reclaiming an interpretation of his life that made sense. Taylor was back. Brooke had stepped away. The chaos had settled, or so he allowed. But beneath that fragile sense of stability, Ridge's world was formerly cracking. He tasted Taylor pulling down but dismissed it as fear, as old injuries resurfacing. He told himself love would fix it. What Ridge didn't realize was that Taylor's heart was formerly tangled nearly differently, bound to a secret she no way intended to reveal. This wasn't a transitory affair or a moment of weakness. This was a connection that had formed still deeply, during a time when Taylor felt unseen, unheard, and emotionally abandoned. And the man at the center of it all was the last person anyone would have anticipated. Eric set up out by accident, the way the most ruinous trueness frequently surface, not through concession, but through an unguarded moment. A name spoken too vocally. A look that dallied too long. A discussion eavesdropped that wasn't meant for his cognizance. When the consummation hit him, it felt like the ground shifted beneath his bases. Taylor, the woman he'd always admired for her integrity and moral compass, was hiding commodity monumental. And worse, it involved someone dangerously close to the family. Eric didn't defy her right down. He demanded to be sure. He demanded to understand how deep this went, because if he was right, the fallout would be disastrous. This wasn't just about broken trust. This was about treason on multiple situations, emotional, domestic, and literal. As the pieces began to fall into place, Eric felt a blend of unbelief and heartache. He flashed back all the times Taylor had spoken about honesty, about mending, about doing what was right for the children and the family. And now then she was, standing on the edge of a Verity that could destroy Ridge fully. Eric scuffled with his part in all of it. Should he cover his son, or respect Taylor's right to her own life? The answer wasn't clear, because no matter what he did, someone would be shattered. The secret nut wasn't just a man from Taylor's history or a stranger who could still vanish. He was someone whose presence would permanently alter the dynamics of the Forrester family. Someone whose involvement turned this from a particular reproach into a full-bloated emotional earthquake. When Ridge eventually learned the Verity, it didn't come gently. It came like a brutal wake-up call, stripping down every vision he'd been adhering to. The disclosure wasn't just that Taylor had moved on emotionally, it was who she had moved on with, and how long it had been going on behind his reverse. Ridge felt lowered, blindsided, and deeply betrayed. He replayed every recent moment in his head, every discussion, every pledge, every look that now felt concave. The woman he believed he was rebuilding a future with had been living a resemblant life, one where he was no longer the center. The consummation crushed him in a way many effects ever had. This wasn't the familiar heartache of losing Taylor to Brooke or vice versa. This was commodity far more particular. This was about being replaced. Eric watched his son unravel and felt the weight of his own silence press down on him. He'd known, or at least suspected, and he hadn't acted presto enough to soften the blow. Now Ridge was twisting, questioning not just Taylor's love, but his own judgment, his own worth, his entire romantic history. The pain etched across Ridge's face was commodity Eric would no way forget. It was the look of a man realizing that the foundation he stood on had formerly collapsed. And Taylor, standing at the center of it all, was forced to defy the consequences of her choices. She hadn't meant for effects to go this far. She hadn't planned on hurting Ridge or Eric. But intentions meant nothing now. The damage was done. The secret nut reveal transferred shockwaves through the entire family. Brooke, though no longer with Ridge, felt the sting of exculpation mixed with anguish. She had advised him, had felt commodity was out, and now her worst reservations were verified. Steffi and Thomas were torn, caught between fidelity to their mama and the inarguable verity that she had caused immense pain. The family lines blurred as everyone plotted to decide where they stood. Taylor's attempt to explain herself only strengthened the injuries, because there was no explanation that could undo the treason. Love, no matter how sincere, didn't abolish the fact that she had chosen secretiveness over honesty. Ridge's world didn't just deteriorate, it collapsed. He began questioning every major relationship in his life, every decision that had led him to this moment. His trust was shattered not just in Taylor, but in the idea that love could ever be simple or safe. He withdrew, emotionally segregating himself in a way that scarified indeed those closest to him. Eric tried to reach him, but the distance was growing, fueled by disappointment and undetermined wrathfulness. For the first time, Ridge wasn't choosing between two women. He was choosing whether or not to believe in love at all. As the dust settled, one thing came sorrowfully clear: nothing at Forrester Creations, or in the Forrester family, would ever be the same again. Taylor's secret had rewritten the narrative of their lives, exposing vulnerabilities and fractures that had been hidden beneath times of complicated history. Eric was left scuffling with the reality that indeed the people he trusted most were able of ruinous choices. Ridge was left standing in the remains of his emotional life, doubtful how or if he could rebuild. And Taylor was forced to face the verity that the love she had tried to cover had eventually bring her everything she formerly held sacred. This wasn't just a reproach. It was a reckoning. And as the consequences continued to unfold, one question dallied over the Forrester family like a shadow: when trust is broken at this position, can it ever truly be repaired? Or is this the morning of an unrecoverable end? In the days following the disclosure, the Forrester estate felt different. The walls that had formerly echoed with arguments, rapprochements, and the familiar meter of family chaos now held an uneasy silence. It was the kind of quiet that came after commodity unrecoverable had happened, when everyone knew the damage couldn't simply be smoothed over with time or explanations. Eric felt it most acutely. As the primogenitor, he'd always believed that no matter how shattered effects came, the family would ultimately find its way back to balance. But this time the fracture ran too deep. Taylor's secret had touched every corner of their lives, unraveling not just Ridge's sense of stability but Eric's belief that he understood the people closest to him. Eric replayed the moment of discovery over and over in his mind, wondering if there had been a point when he could have stopped it, diverted it, or at least prepared Ridge for the verity. He'd spent decades navigating the emotional minefield that was Ridge's love life, frequently acting as middleman, counselor, and quiet protection. But this time he felt helpless. The secret nut reveal hadn't just blindsided Ridge, it had exposed a vulnerability in Eric himself. He realized how important he'd reckoned on the idea of Taylor as a constant, a moral anchor in a family defined by emotional axes. Losing that certainty left him unmoored. Ridge, meanwhile, moved through his days like someone on autopilot. He still showed up at Forrester Creations, still reviewed designs, still attended meetings, but the spark was gone. His mind was away, trapped in an endless circle of recollections and unanswered questions. Every smile Taylor had given him in recent months now felt like a taradiddle. Every consolation she had offered replayed in his head with a cruel new environment. The treason wasn't just emotional, it felt intellectual, as if his intelligence and suspicion had been disrespected. Ridge flattered himself on reading people, on seeing shifts before they happened. And yet, the woman he allowed. He knew better than anyone had been living a retired verity right under his nose. The hardest part for Ridge wasn't just losing Taylor. It was the demotion. Knowing that others had tasted commodity was wrong, that Eric had suspected, that Brooke had still observed from the sidelines, made him feel exposed. He abominated the idea of being ached, abominated indeed more the study that his pain was getting another chapter in the long-running saga of his romantic failures. This wasn't supposed to be how affects ended with Taylor. He'd imagined collective respect, perhaps indeed a peaceful separation if affects didn't work out. Rather, he was left with treason and questions that refused to settle. Taylor, for her part, set up herself insulated in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had known the verity would ultimately come out, but she had undervalued the emotional desolation it would beget. She told herself she hadn't set out to hurt anyone. The connection she had formed with her secret nut had grown sluggishly, born out of vulnerability and participated understanding during a time when she felt unnoticeable. Ridge's emotional distance, his constant pull toward the history, had left her feeling secondary in her own life. The new relationship had made her feel seen again. But as the consequences unfolded, Taylor was forced to defy an uncomfortable reality feeling understood didn't justify the damage she had caused. Steffi plotted deeply with the situation. As a son, her instinct was to cover her mama, to understand her choices and defend her right to happiness. But as Ridge's child, she couldn't ignore the pain etched into his face, the way his confidence had been stripped down. Steffi had grown up watching her parents hurt each other constantly, but this felt different. This wasn't a collective breakdown or a participated failure. This was a secret that had been kept designedly, and that distinction counted heavily on her. She set up herself caught between empathy and disappointment, doubtful which emotion merited more space. Thomas, on the other hand, replied with a quieter intensity. He didn't lash out or take sides intimately, but his trust in Taylor shifted in subtle ways. He'd always viewed her as the emotional safe haven of the family, the one person who constantly supported for mending and responsibility. Now, he questioned whether those values had always been as solid as he believed. Thomas understood secretiveness and preoccupation better than utmost, and that consummation unsettled him. Seeing his Mama Glass actions he'd formerly been blamed for forced him to defy uncomfortable parallels. Brooke observed everything from a careful distance. She had no desire to fit herself into Ridge's pain, but she couldn't deny the complicated blend of feelings rising within her. There was sadness for Ridge, yes, but also a sense of grim confirmation. She had felt commodity was wrong long before the verity came out. The guarded way Taylor spoke, the way Ridge sounded constantly uncertain despite claiming happiness, it had all refocused to commodity undetermined. Brooke didn't feel triumphant, however. The situation corroborated her belief that Ridge's heart had no way truly been safe with anyone, including herself, if anything. Watching him unravel reminded her of the emotional risk their history had taken on both of them. As the family grappled with the emotional fallout, the identity of Taylor's secret nut continued to impend like a ticking time lemon. Though the verity was known to a select many, its full counteraccusations hadn't yet gurgled outward. The man's involvement wasn't just particular, it had professional and domestic consequences that hovered to destabilize being alliances. Eric bothered about how the disclosure would affect the company, the family's public image, and the fragile peace they had been trying to maintain. He knew that once the secret nut's identity came extensively known, there would be no controlling the narrative. Ridge ultimately brazened the deeper crack beneath his wrathfulness, the fear that he was unlovable in a continuing way. He'd always told himself that his failed connections were the result of complicated circumstances, external pressures, and insolvable choices. But Taylor's treason forced him to look inward. What if the common denominator wasn't fate or timing, but him? That study visited him, dicing down at his confidence and leaving him questioning his future. For the first time, Ridge considered the possibility of stepping down not just from Taylor or Brooke, but from the emotional chaos that had defined his adult life. Eric tried to bridge the growing distance between himself and Ridge, but every discussion felt strained. Ridge wasn't angry at his father exactly, but there was a subtle resentment stewing beneath the face. Eric's dubitation, his vacillation to speak up, felt like a silent treason of its own. Eric understood that since didn't matter then. Feelings weren't rational, and Ridge's pain demanded space further than explanations. Still, the rift hurt. Eric had always believed that no matter what happened between Ridge and the women in his life, their bond would remain imperturbable. Now, indeed, that certainty felt fragile. Taylor faced mounting pressure from all sides. Musketeers prompted her to explain herself intimately, to take control of the narrative before rumors filled the void. Others advised silence, believing that any attempt at defense would only make effects worse. Taylor set up herself questioning whether she merited remission at all. She had spent her life championing for emotional honesty, yet when it signified most, she had chosen secretiveness. That contradiction counted heavily on her heart. The love she had tried to cover now felt alloyed, overshadowed by the destruction it had caused. As weeks passed, the emotional injuries showed no signs of mending. Ridge's pullout came more pronounced, intimidating those around him. He stopped engaging in particular exchanges, diverting concern with professionalism and distance. Work came his retreat, but indeed that could completely distract him from the sense of loss. The future he'd envisaged, one of stability, cooperation, and emotional peace, had faded. And unlike once Dolor, this bone didn't come with a clear path forward. The family began to realize that this wasn't just another chapter in their long history of romantic fermentation. This was a turning point. Connections would be readdressed, commitment reassessed, and long-held hypotheticals challenged. Taylor's secret nut reveal had forced everyone to defy uncomfortable trueness about trust, honesty, and the cost of emotional avoidance. It exposed the fragility beneath the family's polished surface, reminding them that no quantum of wealth or heritage could shield them from the consequences of their choices. By the time the dust began to settle, one thing was sorrowfully clear: the Forrester family stood at a crossroads. The history could no longer be reckoned upon as a companion for the future. Old patterns had led them then to a place of profound hurt and query. Whether they would choose growth or repeat the same cycles remained to be seen. But for Ridge, Eric, and Taylor, the world as they knew it had formerly changed. And the coming disclosure, when the secret nut's identity completely came into the light, promised to shake their lives indeed further, pushing them toward opinions that would define the rest of their stories. As the emotional shockwaves continued to ripple outward, a deeper apprehension settled over the Forrester family, one that couldn't be ignored or explained down. The treason had exposed further than a secret love. It had revealed how disconnected everyone had come from one another. Eric began to question whether the family's long-standing habit of avoiding delicate trueness had eventually caught up with them. For times, emotional lanes and half-trueness had been disguised as protection. Now those choices were demanding a painful reckoning. Ridge's insulation grew heavier with each passing day. Musketeers and associates noticed the change in him. Not just sadness, but a quiet abdication that suggested commodity inside him had shut down. The man who formerly thrived on passion and possibility now sounded exhausted by the veritably idea of closeness. He no longer trusted his instincts, and that loss cut deeper than the treason itself. Ridge began to understand that his heartache wasn't solely about Taylor's secret nut, but about the consummation that the future he'd been chasing might no way live in the way he imagined. Taylor, meanwhile, set up herself visited by the consequences of her silence. The relationship she had tried to shield now felt fragile, strained under the weight of exposure. She began to see how her need for emotional safety had led her to make choices that contradicted everything she believed about honesty and responsibility. The further she reflected, the clearer it came that secretiveness hadn't defended anyone, it had only delayed the ineluctable damage. And now, the cost was far lesser than if she had faced the verity before. Steffi watched her parents drift further piecemeal emotionally, and the impact hit near to home than she anticipated. She bothered about what this meant for her own understanding of love and commitment. The situation forced her to defy an uncomfortable fear that no relationship, no matter how deeply embedded, was vulnerable to collapse. That fear dallied, shaping her perspective in subtle but continuing ways. Eric stood at the center of it all, bearing the quiet burden of leadership and remorse. He wondered whether the heritage he'd erected was strong enough to survive another fracture of this magnitude. The family had endured dishonors ahead, but this one felt different because it struck at the core of their emotional integrity. Trust, formerly broken, didn't fluently return. As the days moved forward, an implied verity settled in mending would bear further than time. It would demand honesty, responsibility, and an amenability to defy patterns that had gone unchallenged for decades. Whether the Forrester family was able of that kind of change remained uncertain. But one thing was inarguable: The reveal of Taylor's secret nut had ever altered their emotional geography, and nothing would ever return to the way it was ahead.